Hello there YouTube, my name is Lori and welcome to Lori's Thrifty Kitchen Pantry. If you're new, welcome. I'm so glad that you found me. If you like what you see, make sure to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell so that you will be notified when I put new videos out. If you are a returning subscriber, welcome back. I am glad that you are all going to spend time in the kitchen with me today. So I'm trying something new today since I'm doing another canning video. I wanted to try doing a voiceover just to see what that was like. So let me know in the comments down below what you think. If it flows a bit better, just let me know and we'll see what happens with it. So I'm canning up my chicken soup. I have everything all diced and the chicken cooked and everything ready to go. So I'm glad to finally be getting that done. I'm doing 4 jars of chicken soup with potatoes, celery, and carrots, and then I'm doing some jars with just celery and carrots that I can go back and add noodles for chicken noodle soup. So that is what we're doing today. If you have anything that we can be in prayer with you about or send you our well wishes or positive thoughts, whatever you need, please leave that down below in the comment section underneath the description box, and let us support you with our prayers and well wishes. We have a great community here, and just let us do that for you if you have anything that you need prayer for. So I'm planning a lot of things where I'm doing my first live video to give that a try. If that works out, I will try to do a live video every week to let you all know what's going on, and just so that I can chat with all of you and keep in touch with what's going on in your lives as well. I love hearing what you guys are doing, and I like spending time with all of you. So that's the plan for right now. During the live chat, there's some fun things I have planned coming up for the next few months, so stay tuned for those. And I think that's about all I got for right now. So let's get into the kitchen and let's get canning. Alright, so my jars have been washed and cleaned and sterilized. So now it's just a matter of putting the stuff in the jars. So I'm starting with the chicken soup jars. You can see I'm dropping some potatoes in there. I have them cut in pretty good sized pieces just so that they hold up during the canning process. So it is just a matter of getting this stuff into the jar. So I'm doing 4 jars of regular chicken soup. So I have all of my ingredients all chopped and ready to go before I started filling my jars. So the hardest part of this video is already done. So I'm just getting the potatoes in the jar, and now I am putting in the tops from the celery that I have to go in there. I don't put a lot in there, just enough, because those celery tops really do add a lot of extra flavor to whatever it is you're making. So So wash the celery tops really good and just chop them up and add them to whatever soup you have. And now I'm just putting in the celery. Again, I left it in pretty good sized chunks because I didn't want the celery to get all mushy during the canning process. And now I'm putting in my carrots, and I'm just kind of shaking the jars up just a little bit to shake all of the ingredients down so that there's more room in the jar. So now I'm just putting my carrots in. You can see my jars are getting pretty full. I try to can things in pint jars because I cook for just myself, and sometimes a quart jar of something is just way too much for me. So I've got my carrots in there, and now I have cooked chicken that I cut into nice sized pieces. I just boiled it on the stove for about 30 minutes, and then I turn the stove off and I cover it and I just let it sit in the water while it cools down some. And I decided that as full as my jars were, it was easier to just put the chicken in the jars, however I could get it in there. So canning is really pretty simple. It's just a matter of following steps and getting your food in the jars. So now I'm doing a chicken noodle base soup. This one is not going to have potatoes in it, so it's going to have chicken, celery, and onions, so that way when I go to heat it up, I can just add my cooked noodles to my soup and have chicken noodle soup if I want it. And then I can always add other cooked vegetables if I decide that I want regular chicken soup. So right now I'm just putting my cooked chicken into my jars. And now I will be adding the carrots to the jars, and I'm just dropping the carrots in there. You can see it's easier to do that with the canning funnel. It has a bigger opening on the bottom so that the food can go through a bit easier. And after this, I will be adding some more of the celery tops, and then I will add a couple of the bigger, right now I'm adding the bigger pieces of celery, and then I'll be putting the celery tops in. And because I'm using wide mouth jars for this soup, it was just easier at this point, as full as the jars were, to just drop the stuff in. So now I'm adding the rest of the celery tops to the jars. Now I make a little bit of a mistake at this point, but I managed to fix it in time. I started filling my jars with water and then happened to remember that I had a big pan of the chicken broth that I used to cook the chicken with sitting on my stove to put into the jars. So you'll see me after I filled the jars up, I suddenly saw the pan sitting there on the stove, so I dumped out the water that was in the jars, and then I added the chicken broth to it. I'd rather have had the chicken broth in the jars just because that adds so much more flavor to whatever kind of soup you're making. So now you can see I'm just dumping the water out of the jars. I held my hand over the top of the jars and just dumped most of the water out. There was probably still a little bit in the very bottom of the jar, but there was still plenty of room to add the chicken broth that I needed to add. So I'm really glad that I caught that mistake when I did. It would have just been really sad to have my jars all filled and the lids on and then turn around and see that wonderful chicken broth sitting on the stove not being used the way I intended to. So I'm really glad that I noticed it when I did. No harm, no foul. And from this point on, everything else is done correctly. So some cooking is trial and error. Sometimes you make mistakes. I thought about editing that part out, and then I thought, you know, we're all human. We all make mistakes, and this one was fixable. So I thought I would just leave it in and let you see that that mistakes do happen, and you just fix it and move on and pray that it comes out. So you can see I'm moving my pan of chicken broth over there, and there's a pan of chicken broth. So now I am going to go back to using my funnel, because when you're doing chicken broth with a ladle, it's just easier to use your canning funnel. And now I'm filling the jars with the chicken broth. You want to leave an inch of headspace, which is just about to the very bottom rim of the neck of the jar is an inch of headspace. It took me a few times of canning to learn that I didn't really need to measure everything. As long as I filled the jars up to that bottom rim, that everything would be good. So I'm just filling up my jars, and I'm really loving the soup timber idea, just because soup makes an absolutely wonderful quick meal. I can warm it up for my lunch and take when I'm working. I actually just started a third job as a substitute teacher, and this is something that I can get heating up on the stove while I get ready for work, and I can prime my thermos jug and then just fill my thermos with a jug of hot soup, and it will stay nice and warm until lunchtime and give me a nice hot lunch while I'm at work. So I am going to love having all these jars of soup. And now I'm just filling up the jars of the regular chicken soup that has the potatoes in it. So this was a wonderful idea. I have another recipe coming up this week. I am going to show you all how to do the absolutely easiest form of vegetable soup that you could ever hope to make, and it's absolutely delicious. So I'm really excited about bringing you my vegetable soup recipe. The broth is actually a surprise ingredient. Now, this is my debubbler tool. That end is all marked so you can actually measure your jars, which I don't really need to do so much anymore. But if you're just starting out canning, it is a wonderful tool to have. And now you use the other end and just get all of the air bubbles out of the jar so that the solids can expand during the canning process, and you can make sure everything is covered. And you can see I added a little bit more of the chicken broth. When you debubble, a lot of times as the food moves around, your liquid level will decrease a little bit. So you just want to retop that off and then make sure once again that the bubbles are out. So that's a really important step that you do not want to skip.
Anytime you are canning, unless it's straight liquids, like if you're doing jelly with jars of juice, you wouldn't necessarily have to debubble because it's all liquid. If you're doing tomato sauce that doesn't have skins or pulp in it, you wouldn't have to debubble because it's all liquid. Now I'm getting the rest of my jars all debubbled. Back to the vegetable soup that I'm gonna be canning up for this week. You all are gonna be very surprised at the ingredient that I use for the broth. I am just so excited to bring you this recipe, and it's one that you don't even have to can up. You can do it in an Instant Pot. You can do it in a crock pot. You can do it on the stove top. It's just a really easy recipe, so I can't wait to share my vegetable soup recipe with you all. So I think you're gonna really enjoy the soup recipe. So I'm just continuing with the debubbling with the vegetable soup with the potatoes, and because it has potatoes in it, you really do need to debubble that really well. And you can see that I add liquid as I go along. It just really needs the help. It needs the extra liquid as the water level drops in your jar. You really need to make that extra liquid up, and sometimes I take an extra piece out if I think my jar's gonna be too full. If it's too full and the solids go to expand, it's going to pop your lid off and cause your seal to fail. And I have had that happen before, so I'm always careful not to have the jars too full. So now I have my jar of cleaning rags. This is just an old t-shirt that I was done wearing. I made sure it was clean, and I cut it up into squares and put it in a jar and filled the jar with vinegar. And I do that instead of using paper towels, just because it was getting awfully expensive for me to can stuff. When you use paper towels, you go through a ton of them, and I just didn't have money to waste on paper towels. So you want to carefully go around the neck and the rim of the jar. Make sure there's nothing on there. It's nice and clean. I have my nice clean lids ready. You put your ring on fingertip tight. When you can't loosely turn it anymore, then you give it another good turn, and then it goes into the canner. So that's this next step. You can see there I have a piece of celery top on that jar, so I wanted to make sure to get that celery top off of there. And just make sure that your jars are nice and clean, no cracks, no nothing on the rim of the jar. I've had lines on the neck of the jar that were bad and didn't line up, so check all of that. So again, take your ring and fingertip tight. You can see I turn the lid, and then when it stops turning, I give it one more good turn, and that's as tight as you have to get it. You don't have to wrench the lids on. If you wrench the lids on, then there's not going to be room for the steam to release and for your jars to seal. As the food expands, it's going to cause your lid to buckle if the ring is on too tight. It has to be on tight enough that it holds the lid in place so that it can seal as it pressure cooks, but it also can't be on too tight or the lid will buckle and you won't have a sealed jar. So again, I'm just giving it one nice good turn after that. And it took me quite a few tries to get the hang of exactly how tight to put my rings. And sometimes I still end up with jars that the rings had loosened up enough that the jars didn't seal. And when that happens, just put it in the refrigerator and eat it in the next couple of days, because it's still fine. You just don't want an unsealed jar sitting on your shelf for very long. So you always want to make sure that your rings are on good. When the jars come out of the pressure canner, they always sit. I always leave mine sit overnight. I go back the next day. I take the rings off. I make sure the jars are all sealed. And I wash them in just lukewarm soapy water. You don't want to use really hot water because it could loosen up some of your seal. So just lukewarm water. There, I'm just putting the ring back on my jar of rags. That you wash your jars off with soapy lukewarm water to make sure that nothing is on the outside of the jars to attract any critters. And you want your jars to be nice and clean when they go on your shelf. And then I let the jars dry and I label on the lid what is in the jar, and I put the month and the year that it was canned. Alright, now I'm not worried about rotating my food because I just started canning a few months ago, so everything has a 2022 date on it. But after December, anything that I pressure can from that point on will be put on the back of the shelf, and everything canned in 2022 will be moved to the front of the shelf so that gets used up first. You always want to keep your jars rotated, and your canned goods too. Anything that you store, you always want to put the things with the closest expiration date in the front so that it goes in first. And now you can see my canner has a mark on the lid. There's a mark on the handle. There's a mark on the lid, and you just line the lids up. So Ethel is all filled up and ready to go. For those who don't know, my Ethel is my canner. And I'm just getting a good angle here so you guys can see into the canner. So it's completely full. I actually have not used Ethel to can wide mouth jars before, so this is a first for me. I usually just do regular mouth jars, but I wanted my soup in the wide mouth jars so that the veggies would come out a bit easier. So now you just line the handles up and make sure that the lid is on nice and tight, and make sure your canner is all centered on the stove and that it's all ready to go. So now I'm going to turn Ethel up to high. That steam vent right there will have steam start to come out. When there is a steady stream of steam coming out, that little locking pin in the back right there will pop up. I will vent the canner for 10 minutes, and then I will put my little weighted jiggler on there, and I will let the temperature gauge come up to 10 pounds of pressure. You need to know your altitude and how much pressure you need to, how much weight you need to pressure can. And I will let that come up to 10 pounds of pressure. The weight will start to jiggle back and forth, and it will start to do its thing. Now you can see right there the steam is coming out, so I'm going to set my timer for 10 minutes. You really need to not skip that step. You can see I got my timer set there. When my timer goes off, I will put my little weighted jiggler on there, and we'll let that come up to the correct weight for the jiggler to jiggle. And I think the safety pin had already popped up. There's the weighted jiggler. When my timer goes off, that will go on over the steam vent. So yes, you can see in the back there behind the temperature gauge that my safety valve is up, so the lid's locked in place. And now it's just a matter of letting Ethel do her thing. I've used her enough. I know where to set my stove. I know once she gets up to pressure and the jiggler starts going, I know where to turn my stove down. And there you can see it's been my 10 minutes, and I'm going to put my jiggler on the steam vent. And now, once that starts going, I will let you see what the jiggler looks like when it's going. And when that gets up to the 10 pounds of pressure, I will turn my stove down to between 4 and 6. And then I will let her go for 75 minutes because we are doing pint jars. It doesn't matter if it's quart jars or regular mouth jars or pint or wide mouth pint jars. Wide mouth pint jars or regular mouth pint jars, I'll get pressure canned at 75 minutes if there's meat in it. And now you can see our jiggler is jiggling. She's at her 10 pounds, so my stove is turned down. My timer goes up to 60 minutes, so I set it for 60 minutes, and I let it get down to 45 minutes, and then I will turn it back to 60 minutes, and that will give me my 75 minutes. So canning is just a process of following the steps and making sure that you have time to let the canner do its thing and to cool down. So you have to, at the end of 75 minutes, turn the stove off. Don't touch it. Don't do anything. You crack the lid after the temperature gauge gets down to 0. You crack the lid very carefully open. Let the lid sit for a few minutes for the steam to come out, and then you can take your jars out of the canner. So it's just a little bit of a process, but it's very easy. Nothing we did was very hard at all. And there you can see our beautiful jars of soup. I did have a wide mouth jar fall out of the canner, but it didn't fall out of the canner, it fell over inside the canner. It took me a few minutes to get it back to where I could get it out of the canner, so there's a little bit of time in between taking the jars out, but you can see our jars are absolutely beautiful. It is just so rewarding having jars of soup on the shelf ready to go, especially if you're sick and not feeling well. Knowing that there's chicken soup on your shelf that all you have to do is throw in the microwave for a couple minutes and you can have something warm inside your tummy that makes you feel better. So it's just really comforting knowing that you have that soup out. Here I think is where I'm having trouble getting that other jar of soup picked back up out of the canner where I could get to it, because these jars are extremely hot, so you have to be very, very careful. I ended up using my jar lifter and another set of tongs to get the jar where I could actually safely lift it out of the canner and not have it fall on the floor. So there are things that happen when you can. You just have to be flexible and go with whatever happens and hope that everything turns out in the end. And the jar that fell over actually did end up sealing. I double checked it very carefully the next morning, and it was fine. There were no cracks in the jar. The jar didn't break. It just tipped over, and I had a lot of trouble getting it back where I could get to it. And I think that's simply because I haven't really canned much using the wide mouth jars. I always use regular mouth jars. So yeah, it did take me quite a while to get that jar to where I could get it, and there you see I finally got that jar out of the canner. So I put that separate from the other jars just so I could keep an eye on it and make sure that it actually can. And at that point there was only a couple jars left in the canner that I was able to get to and safely lift out of the canner. And if you're going to be canning, you really need to make sure you have a good jar lifter, because, man, those jars get so hot. You can tell that they're bubbling away, and that glass and the metal rims just get extremely hot. So you really do need a good jar lifter. So there you can see our jars of soup. I will just let them sit there, and again in the next morning I will take the rings off and let them I will take the rings off, I will check the seals, I will wash them, I will let the jars dry, and then I will label and date them. And that's all there is to it. There was a couple things that went wrong that I fixed, but we still have 8 jars of soup to put up.